A poor shepherdess fed a stranger her last crust. He owned every ranch she'd passed. The bread was stale. I know that because I remember the sound it made when she broke it, not the soft pull of fresh-baked, but a dry crack, like a branch underfoot. She broke it in half without looking at me, held out the larger piece and said, "You look like you haven't eaten since Tuesday." That was the whole of it, no ceremony. She just handed it over and turned back to her sheep. I stood there at the edge of her camp, with a piece of someone else's bread in my hand, and I didn't know what to do with myself. I'd ridden 40 miles that day on a horse I'd been trying to rest, and I'd come down off the ridge above Larkspur Creek because I'd seen her fire and my gut had twisted with something I hadn't felt in longer than I could say. Hunger. Real hunger, not the wanting kind. I ate the bread. It was hard and it tasted of wood smoke, and I ate every crumb. She had maybe 60 sheep on a patch of grass that barely deserved the name, a dog of uncertain parentage sleeping against her bedroll, and a pot of something over the fire that smelled like onion and not much else. She was maybe 30, or close to it, wore a man's coat 3 sizes too wide across the shoulders. Her boots had been resoled at least twice. You could see where the stitching changed color at the toe. She didn't ask my name, didn't ask where I was going, poured me a cup of coffee from a dented pot, and said the sheep needed moving before first light, so she'd be turning in soon, and I was welcome to the fire until then. I told her I was grateful. She said grateful was fine, but she needed more wood if I had the energy. I went and got her wood. My name is Callum Reed. I was 53 years old that autumn, and I owned, depending on how you counted, somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 acres of grassland, timber and river frontage, running from the Powder River Basin down through 3 counties. I had interests in a mine, a mill, and 2 banks. I had a house in Cheyenne with 16 rooms that I slept in perhaps 40 nights a year. I had a foreman named Briggs, who ran everything so well that some mornings I wondered if I was needed at all. I did not tell the shepherdess any of this. I had been riding alone for 6 days by then, which was not something I did often and which I had started doing because I needed to remember something I'd lost. I'm not sure I could have named it then. Something about what it felt like to be a man without all the acreage attached. I'd left my good horse in Laramie, borrowed a plain brown gelding from a livery, packed light, and ridden north with no particular destination. Just open country and my own thoughts, which turned out to be poor company. The ranches I'd passed as a stranger and nobody had known me, and that had been the point. But it had also been strange to ride through land I partially owned and be nobody. To stop at a town I'd helped charter and be just another dusty rider. Nobody owed me anything. Nobody needed anything from me. I was invisible in a way I'd spent 30 years trying not to be, and I found I didn't know what to do with that either. Then I came down off the ridge above Larkspur Creek, and she broke her last piece of bread in half and handed it over without looking up. I thought about that for a long time, while I was stacking her wood, while I was sitting at her fire, long after she'd rolled herself into her blanket with her back to the flames and her dog pressed against her knees. She hadn't known who I was, hadn't asked. Hadn't looked at my hands to see if they were working hands or ownership hands. She'd just seen a man who looked like he hadn't eaten since Tuesday and acted accordingly. I sat at her fire until the coals went low, and I thought, when is the last time anyone gave me something without knowing what I was worth? I couldn't find the answer. Her name was Nora Vass. I learned it the next morning when she was breaking camp. I'd slept a few hours rolled in my coat, a decent distance from her fire, close enough for warmth, far enough not to presume, and I woke to the sound of the dog working the sheep and her whistling at it in short, specific bursts that the dog seemed to understand perfectly. I watched her pack for a while before she noticed I was awake and said, without particular emotion, "There's coffee." There was. I drank it and watched her fold her camp with the economy of someone who'd done it 500 times. Everything had a place. Nothing wasted emotion. I asked where she was headed. North, she said. There was a leash she held on grass up near the Sundown Basin, another 2 days' drive. Her voice carried the careful flatness of someone who expected to be asked if she had a husband or a father doing the real work, and was tired of the question and its implication. I didn't ask. I knew what that flatness meant. She asked, neutral as a fence post, if I was going north or south. North, I said, which was true enough. She nodded. Said the trail split about 4 miles on, and she'd be taking the low fork. Said it like she was giving me information I might need, not like she was suggesting anything. I rode north with her that day, the low fork as it turned out. I've tried to think clearly about what happened over those 2 days, and I'm not sure I've ever managed it. What I can say is this. I had spent 30 years in the company of people who wanted something from me, and most of them were skilled enough at it that you couldn't see it directly. It was in the angle of a handshake, the particular warmth of an invitation. Even the ones who meant well, my foreman Briggs, my lawyers, the men who sat on boards with me, there was always a transaction somewhere underneath. I didn't hold it against them. That's how the world operates. But Nora Vass wanted nothing. She was not cold. She was not unfriendly. She talked when she talked, the way a person talks who's been alone long enough that conversation doesn't come automatically but isn't unwelcome when it does. She told me about the lease, about the 3 years it had taken her to build her flock from 11 animals to 62, about a bad winter 2 years back that had killed 14 sheep and nearly killed her dog and had cost her everything she'd saved. She told it the way you tell a fact, not a complaint. It happened, she'd gotten through it. The next winter was better. She asked me what I did, and I said I managed some land interests. She nodded and didn't ask more, which told me she was either incurious or smart enough to know that when a man's answer is that vague, he's left something out and asking further isn't polite. Smart, I decided. She was smart. She asked me, on the afternoon of the first day, why I was riding alone. I thought about it. I said I'd been trying to remember what it was like to be nobody for a while. She looked at me sideways, said, "Is it working?" I said I wasn't sure yet. She was quiet for a moment, then, "I've always been nobody. It's not as peaceful as it sounds." She said it without bitterness, just a statement of fact, like the thing about the 14 sheep. I didn't say anything back. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't have sounded hollow. But I turned it over in my mind for the rest of that afternoon, that sentence, the plain weight of it. I've always been nobody. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She wasn't asking for anything. She was just telling me the truth the way she told everything straight out, unadorned, take it or leave it. That night we camped on a flat above a dry creek bed and I cooked, because I was the one with the provisions and it seemed right. Salt pork and hard biscuit and dried apple. Nothing impressive, but she ate with the same straightforward attention she gave everything and said it was good, and I believed her because she didn't say things she didn't mean. After the fire went low, she said, "You're not a drifter." I said, "No." "But you're not looking for work either." "No." She thought about that. "Doesn't matter," she said finally, and banked the coals and went to sleep. We reached the Sundown Basin lease on the second afternoon. The grass was good, I could see that immediately. Better than what she'd left behind, greener, with a creek running through the middle of it that was still carrying water this late in the season. Someone had filed the lease papers right. She'd picked her ground well. She moved the sheep in with the dog, and then stood at the edge of her new camp looking at it with something in her face I recognized. The particular satisfaction of a thing done that you'd spent a long time working toward. Not happiness exactly, relief and pride mixed together. I helped her set camp. We didn't talk much. The work organized itself the way it does when two people have spent enough time alongside each other to know the rhythm. When it was done, when the fire was going and the sheep were settled and the dog was asleep again in his spot against her bedroll, she sat down and looked at me across the fire and said, "What's your actual name?" I told her, Callum Reed. She was quiet for a moment. Not the blankness of someone who didn't recognize it. I could see the recognition moving through her face, but the stillness of someone recalculating, going back through 2 days of conversation and checking things against a new piece of information. She looked at the fire, then she looked at me. You own the Larkspur Range, she said, the one south of where we camped the first night. Part of it. And the Sundown Basin lease, she stopped. That lease clears through reed land and cattle. I said yes. She was very still. I watched her work through it, not the flattery or the calculation I'd have seen on another face, but something harder and more honest. Anger, maybe, or the particular pride of someone who'd been interacted with under false pretenses and didn't like it. I didn't lie to you, I said. I said I managed some land interests. That's a notable omission. Yes. Why? I thought about how to answer that. I said, because I wanted 2 days of being a man someone would hand bread to. She looked at me for a long time. The fire cracked and settled. And, she said, and nothing, that's the whole of it. I needed to know if anyone would. Another long silence. The dog shifted against her leg. I would have given you the bread either way, she said. I know, I said, that's the point. She asked me to leave in the morning. Not with anger, with something more complicated than that. She needed to think, she said, and she couldn't think with me sitting there being whatever I was. I respected that. I saddled my horse at first light and went. I rode south. I thought about her the whole way. Not in the way I should probably admit to a stranger. In the way you think about a thing that's shifted something in you and you're not sure yet where it's shifted to. I thought about the bread, the dry crack of it. The matter-of-factness of the gesture, here, you look hungry. I thought about the flatness in her voice when she'd told me she'd always been nobody, and how she'd said it like she was reporting the weather. I thought about the way she'd looked at me across the fire when I told her the truth, the careful recalculation moving through her eyes, and how she hadn't flinched away from it or toward it, just held it and looked at it. She was the most honest person I'd met in years, possibly longer. I rode back to Laramie, got my horse, sent a wire to Briggs that I'd be back in 10 days, rode north again. I want to be plain about this next part because I've told it wrong before, or not told it at all, and the wrongness has sat with me. I was not going back to offer her anything. I was not going back to make her life easier with money she hadn't asked for. That would have been a different kind of transaction, and she'd have known it, and she'd have been right to send me away for good. I went back because I wanted to sit across a fire from someone who would break their last crust in half without looking up, and I wanted her to know who she'd given it to. I went back because I was 53 years old, and I'd spent a long time being valuable to people for the wrong reasons, and I thought maybe she was the only person I knew who could tell the difference. I went back because when I'd said I was trying to remember what it was like to be nobody, she'd understood it. Nobody asked you what you meant by that, she just knew. She saw me coming from a distance. The dog picked me up first and started toward me, and she turned on her horse to look. I pulled up at the edge of the grass and waited, let her come to me or not. She came, rode up and stopped a few feet out, looking at me the way she looked at everything level, taking stock. You came back, she said. Yes. Why? I said what was true. Because I think you're the most honest person I've run across in a long time, and I'd like to spend more time in the company of someone honest. She considered that. She had the look of someone who'd had a few days to think and had thought carefully. You own half of what I can see from here, she said. Roughly. That's a problem. I know. People will say things about why I'm wherever you are. They'll say whatever they want to say. It'll follow me. Yes. She looked at me, and you're still here. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned her horse and looked out at her sheep on the good grass by the creek, The whole thing she'd built from 11 animals and a lot of winters. "There's coffee," she said. She rode back toward her camp. I followed. That was 11 years ago. We didn't make it easy on ourselves or anybody else, and I won't pretend we did. There were people who thought what they thought and said it, and there were months in the second year when we nearly split the whole thing apart over a disagreement, so specific I almost can't reconstruct it now. And there was her pride, God, her pride, which was immovable as stone, and which I came to love as much as anything, and my habits, which were not always the habits of a man used to considering another person. But I remember this. A year after she came back with me to the Cheyenne house, a house she hated for the first 6 months and called a museum, which was fair. I came in late from a long ride and she was in the kitchen, which she'd taken over entirely and in which I was now largely a guest, and I was tired down to the bone the way you get after a day that's just been hard from start to finish. Nothing dramatic, just wait. She didn't ask about it. She put a plate down in front of me and sat across the table. She looked at me, just looked, the way she looked at the grass that first afternoon, the same quality of attention, the way she gave everything. Direct, full, nothing held back. She said, "You look like you haven't eaten since Tuesday." She said it the same way she'd said it the first time. Not performing it, just saying it because it was true and because she'd always said the true thing. I looked at her across the table in that big house that she'd made into something livable through sheer stubborn will, and something turned over in my chest that I didn't have a name for and couldn't have said out loud without making it smaller. I ate the food she'd made. After a while she put her hand over mine on the table, and we sat there in the kitchen with the lamp burning low, and that was all. That was everything.